Fire. Fire, sisters and brothers. We follow a God who brings fire. The one who baptizes us with fire. The one who anoints us with tongues of fire. The one who refines our lives through fire. Fire that consumes, fire that burns, fires that purify, but fire that divides, fire that destroys, fire that can kill. This text is a very hard one for all of us, isn't it? From the commentaries I read about this, there's always an uneasiness with this text, a way of finding some kind of excuse to Jesus. We are always rationalizing it in order to move away from the division thing, from the contention, from conflict. Because we cannot accept that, right? We have no tools to figure out this text. Well, some of the most liberals will say, Jesus was depressed. And so when we are depressed, we say things like that. But don't pay much attention to it. But I suspect that our difficulties with this text have to do with the places in which we are located. And I will mention this because this is what I'm going to develop later. It is the class status that we have in conjunction with the notion of the gospel that we have. So the sense of this class belonging with a gospel that is not that much associated with justice sometimes. It's something that does not change much society and the deep-rooted prejudices and systems of oppression. So we don't see this as a conflict because the gospel doesn't provoke much of this conflict, isn't it? I think it's also because we have this sometimes we have a reduced notion of the gospel that we reduce to a bunch of nice quotes that make a nice Jesus. A gospel of a kind of a my big brother Jesus that impels us to sing a harmless kumbaya in our communities. I think we have psychologized this Jesus so much that what is left of him is only that which you and me can take. And we cannot take that much from this Jesus or from this gospel. And what happens is that mostly in our congregations, our Jesus or the Jesus of the gospel does not demand much, right? And when we preach about something harsh, we almost have to apologize that we are saying some harsh things. And texts that demand us to change are either skipped in or we put into perspective so you can have multiple interpretations and kind of avoiding it. So it is easy for us to hear people saying, "Pastor, don't tell me what to do," or "Don't say these things to us." We know what to do. So in some ways, we have appeased this gospel to fit into the world's Western culture and to sustain a system of oppression that is the capitalistic system of oppression, and we don't offer anything different. So I wonder, when Jesus was saying to his disciples, they are in the world, but they are not of the world, sometimes I think you could translate this as Jesus saying, they're so much a part of the world, they don't even know who they are. We have made the gospel of Jesus an image of our own selves sometimes, right? Anything that does not reflect my personal likes and my worldview must be rebuked as a non-gospel. See, I teach preaching and worship. And when I ask my students to evaluate some worship services, They come with, I like this, I don't like that. And what we need to talk about is that it is not what you like or don't like that really matters. Right? Because the service cannot be the image of your likes or dislikes. Otherwise, you'll only be participating into your own religion, into your own gospel, and what you have made of your own gospel. I think what we need to see when we look at a worship service as in a sermon is how this preaching has to do with the love of God and the love of the neighbor. How we hold together our glory to God in our search for justice. Another problem with the interpretation of this text is that white Protestantism cannot deal with conflict. Why? We avoid it at all possible cost. It is hard to deal with communities that contend, that engage in discussions, and remain with differences. For us, churches, either everyone agrees or I have to look for another church. No. I want a church that engage into this conflict, that agree to be different in different issues, and stay together even in places of contention and antagonism, so that we can worship God with and because of our differences. And as we have our differences, we struggle for what we think is right until we change, and then we change each other and we move each other as we go. Also, another reason is that I think sometimes we make God's love too naive or powerless. We have a God that loves us in a very shy way. And sometimes God is this inoperative kind of God. God's love is not a force, but a vague thought. Or perhaps a feeling. God's love does not destroy things, does not break us from inside. It just offers some kind of comfort. God's love does not operate miracles because we are too enlightened to receive miracles. But if we look at God's love, it breaks things down. It binds people into different ways. It reconnects us with much stronger senses in our lives. So God's love demands this metanoia, this shift, this change, this moving from one side to the other. And God's love doesn't ask for any excuses. So, and then the other thing is that we have disconnected the gospel with justice. It has so much to do with our own inner feelings or our own denominational issues that we forget that this justice is for the world. And when we talk about justice, it's not about talkative justice, but justice that uproots things, that brings troubles into the world, that brings division into the world. Justice that hurts, justice that divides, justice that opposes people, situations, and governments. Because justice will always upset those in power. Justice will always upset those who have against those who do not have. So how do we sense this sense of division in our families, in our churches? So let me give you an example. Brazil is going through a process of, it just impeached its president. And Brazil is divided into two sides. One that is in favor of the impeachment, and another that is against. I'm completely against the impeachment. And I have a real hard time understanding those who are in favor of it, because I think it's just the private sector owning everything that is common. But here's the tension. In my house, most of my family are in favor of the impeachment. And what do? I cannot even talk to them about this, because it's such an explosive thing. How do I learn to talk with the ones that I love and where I belong over issues that I cannot even have a minimum space inside of me to work with. So then I understand Jesus' text. So when we understand this text from a class struggle perspective, we might have a better sense of how to go about it, perhaps. But since we only we belong to a same class, it's hard to see the difference, the radical differences, right? But if you try to understand this text from a Jesus who comes from the lower classes, demanding justice, a kind of a justice that demands restoration, that demands that some people cannot have all they want, that people cannot have 2 houses of 2 cars if somebody doesn't have at least one, that we have to give what we have, then we start to see the complications and the divisions right there. So if you want to understand this text, try to make every pastor receive the same salary in your denomination. Try to make CEOs of denominations, seminaries, and Christian institutions to receive the same salaries of staff people. Try to make, if you expand that, try to make the 1% of rich people in this country to give their money to the rest of the 99%. Or try to make every neighborhood open for black people. Or try to make same conditions for living for whites, blacks, Latinos, Asians, and indigenous people. You will see the conflicts arising. Try to dismantle the actual system for racist system for profit of our prison now and the incarceration rates, mostly with the black and Latinos. Or when we try to wrestle with the LGBTQA community, and we try to see that not only as an option, but as a demand. And then we will understand Jesus saying, don't think I came to bring peace. Not peace, but division. This division Jesus is saying is about the opposition of what the gospel demands and our social, racial, sexual, patriarchal systems of prejudice and oppression. Sometimes when we think of Jesus, just in the pettiness, so to speak, of our inner relationship conflicts, we lose the larger sense of what it does, even the possible healing of it. When we diminish Jesus and Jesus' gospel too much, we lose the sense of the restorative aspect of this very gospel. So I think for us to think about this, for instance, as one example of raising division is when Jesus' ministry is seen as a way of doing civil disobedience. So Jesus does not have a sense of aligning himself to the powers that be, but he creates opposition and brings about disruption and division because he was going against the oppressive power. So his death was also fundamentally caused by his disruptive, dangerous ministry. If Jesus paid to Caesar what belonged to Caesar, he also dismantled the selling market inside of the temple. He broke the understandings of Sabbath, and he gave new interpretation of the law. He gave new meanings to the ways people should live and how we should share. He was absolutely harsh to rich people. He brought into the light those who were in the shadow of societies, and he ate and hung out with women, sinners, drunkards, and losers. He was upsetting the whole system. He brought a consuming fire to his society. Division right there, right? And this fire was such that the civil and religious authorities of his time decided to put this fire out before it burned more established societal conventions and oppressive systems that were in place. So as this theologian from Latin America says, Jesus was a man who could not bear the suffering of most miserable human beings of the world. And no doubt that was motivated Jesus to disobey the constituted power. The most important thing when we talk about civil disobedience in Jesus is that Jesus defended and freed those who suffered, disobeyed the law because they were unjust laws. established by society of his time. Which mean that the determining principle of the conduct of Jesus was not the submission of the rule of law, but to face the pain, oppression, injustice, inequality of rights, and the hard conditions of the excluded and the marginalized. And overall, all that it was a source of suffering for the most vulnerable and helpless with whom we associate as Christians. So when we associate ourselves with the poor, we start to see the things that we naturalized, such as the unequal way of living. We are just fine with those class divisions, just how just it is. And the divisions of haves and have-nots. Some people were either blessed or lucky to have some things and others were not. We are just fine with inequality within our own churches. As I mentioned, the pastor's salaries differences. Why we condone that? This is when I say that we have shrunk the gospel into what we can do. Because there's no way that we can accept the pastors who have different salaries if we are all the Imago Dei, right? Because if we are the Imago Dei, that's not only spiritually, it's financially as well. But we just skip that part. When we associate ourselves with the lower places where some pastors are working with 2-3 churches for $10,000 or for less than 20 because then they don't have to pay so that the church won't pay benefits. How does that justice have to do, this gospel have to do with our living together? Or when we associated with the oppressed people, that we start to see the unfairness of the ways we treat. And this is a harsh thing for us. I don't know about your church, that's what I'm talking about here too. But I think there's something for us to understand about the unfairness and the injustice in which LGBTQA people are treated. And so then we start to talk about justice for them. And here's a conflict that you and me might disagree right now. And when we get into this fight, we're surely to have discord coming from many places. But there's so much division, right? And hurt from these families and for these people. And to be a Christian is to say where we stand and try to change each other. So I'm being very open to you so that we can try to, because any conflict can only be solved if there is a space of honesty between us. So, or when we associate with the oppressed people, to see that the killings, the incarceration, and the dismantling of the social life of black people in this country. The civil rights movement was the best interpretation of these words of Jesus for us. You want to interpret this text for today? Look at the civil rights movement, and there's a long interpretation of it. When they associate with the oppressed people and start to see the brutal destruction of the indigenous people everywhere, and how we are still stealing their lands and destroying their lives, then we understand that the struggle for justice for indigenous people will bring also divisions between people. Or when we associate with oppressed people, we start to see how immigrants are treated in this country and as a new slave so that all of us can live well but them. We can surely see that there will be problems and divisions coming. Concluding, if we start with a look at ourselves and start to see our inability, all of us together, to understand this text because we are not fully committed to the least of these. And that our reading of the Bible is a comfortable, classist reading of the Bible. If we start assuming that we invoke peace to prevent the conversation, any conversation about justice. We love to talk about internal denominational issues, but we don't really deal with the issues of those who are hungry. Let's assume too that we say glory to God as we do not pay attention to those around us in real need. Let's assume that when we pass the peace of Christ, we don't really care if our brother and sister, really need something. Let's face that we try to avoid the conflicts because we're very insecure. And we don't have this threads of trust between us to be open, to be vulnerable to each other, and to wait for God's healing for all of us. If we start there, the next time we sing Kumbaya will be a little different. And then when we read this text, we won't be afraid or frustrated or in an uneasy way to try to make sense of it, but instead our prayer will be, yes, God, yes. Bring that fire of division, of confusion to us, like the Pentecost. So your justice will come down to us like a mighty river. May God bless you and all of us.